Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershift, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, class. Welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining us today. Did you know that the men who would later lead a revolution in Haiti against imperialistic France actually fought with the French and the American rebels in the Battle of Savannah? That Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, fought another pitched battle, but it didn't go so well, with him literally fleeing 180 miles from the battle. And that the first 3 battles fought in the South after the British changed their strategy were overwhelming victories for the British Empire, making things look not so great for the Americans leading into 1780. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out, because today we will learn that and more in episode 67, The War Moved South. All right, welcome into episode 67, The War Moved South. This is not your typical extra credit episode. Usually our extra credit episodes focus on like one primary event or person or theme, but I do know how much my fellow history nerd Zach Woods loves the Southern Theater and enjoys discussing it. So, Zach, welcome to the podcast to help me with this sort of like lecture narrative episode. It's like not quite the extra credit that we normally do.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, sure. And this is part 1, right? Because we're doing like a 2-parter. And next episode will be the War Moved South part 2.
Yeah, so should we call this, part 1, right? British success, or so, I don't know, something along those lines.
Sure, yeah. If we had thought of it before we started recording, we could
British victory or
something clever like that. Yeah, but maybe I'll just add a part 1.
The Empire Strikes Back.
Title. Yeah. Oh, that's original.
By the
way, clearly you don't see how original my titles are, because I included that the British Empire Strikes Back in the one of the episodes on the French Indian War. So pay more attention, man.
I don't know what
episode it is off the top of my head. I'm not sure what episode it is. But no, I'm not going to repeat that. That's just
unoriginal.
That's lame. Yeah, of course. Book recommendation from last week. We don't have a book recommendation from this week. Book recommendation from last week, though, that I put up on the Facebook and Twitter sphere that I forgot to mention during the recording is American Independence. The men of France and Spain who saved it. So it's actually, Brothers in Arms, American Independence and the Men of France and Spain Who Saved It. Like I said, that was last week, so if you go to Facebook or Twitter, you can see that. It's by Larry D. Ferrero, and that is a book that you've read, Zach, and you really like, correct?
Yeah, I liked it. It's always interesting getting different perspectives on events, especially ones that, we're brought up hearing the mythos and the story and the histories of. So when someone is able to dive into the archives from other perspectives and bring new information to light, it's very interesting. So when we get to the Battle of Yorktown, for instance, if you had seen the French and the American forces marching together, you would have thought it was all one army, because basically at that point, the Americans were completely equipped with French clothes, shoes, powder, bullets, and muskets from the French.
Talk about that, though.
Hence why the American military wore blue all the way through the Civil War.
There you go. Very good. Very good. I like it. Oh, another update. There is a special Patreon episode that's dropping because during this time period that we're talking about, we'll be focusing on the South, but in the North, a pretty big event's going on, and that is Benedict Arnold becoming the most infamous traitor in American history. And I am going to be doing a Benedict Arnold becomes a traitor episode. I'm going to be dropping it on Patreon tomorrow. So if you want to sign up to be a patron of the show, you can check that out, and I'll be putting that up tomorrow. And then later, Zach, Bill, and I will be doing a Q&A at some point. I think next month we'll be putting up on Patreon, and we will be doing a special on The Patriot and the fact and fiction from the film The Patriot that we'll be putting up on Patreon too. So we're excited about that. So if you could support the show at patreon.com/teachershistory, check those things out. Please do that. So let's jump into it. Today, Zach and I are going to be discussing the operations in the South, right? The War Moving South, Part 1, so to speak. But I do want to just take a quick moment. And Zach, I know that you listened to the episode last week on the French and Spanish involvement, and there were just a couple other things you wanted to mention on how big of an impact that the French and Spanish involvement really did have in the war for the Americans.
So with the Spanish and the French joining the war becomes global. It is the war for empire now, and the American theater is going to become secondary from that imperial perspective. So to put some numbers behind this, in 1778, 41% of the British fleet is serving off the coast of the United States, or the soon-to-be United States, whereas only 8% was in the sugar-rich islands of the Caribbean. By the end of 1779, a full third of the British fleet will be in the Caribbean, and only 9% will be off the shores of the nascent United States. In 1780, it's 13%, and in 1781, it's 11%. So the very action of France and Spain joining the war isn't just the flow of supplies, money, arms, troops, ships. It's also the ability to basically tear at the imperial gains that the British had from the 7 Years' War, known in the United States as the French and Indian War. So there's battles raging in India, the Caribbean, all across the colonial possessions, and how that really puts a strain on the war government's coffers and ability to really basically justify trying to put down the rebellion in the Americas.
Yeah, that's a good point, Zach. And I'm glad you brought up another thing that I didn't mention last week that I wanted to mention too, is when Spain joins the fight, they make sure that they ally themselves with France, not with the American colonies, which makes a lot of sense because when you have a monarchical country like Spain allying themselves with a bunch of rebels who are trying to overthrow a king probably isn't the best look for a king.
Yeah, so Spain has colonial possessions. They don't want to set a precedent. Rather, they're linked. Exactly. They're linked to the fellow Bourbon on the throne of the French kingdom, right?
Yeah, and that was one more thing I meant to mention last week and I forgot. So I'm glad we got to include here. So transitioning from the French and the Spain joining, right, and we talked about Saratoga and Valley Forge. Now we're moving down south, and we're going to be going down south and focusing on 1778, 1779, and in 1780. But I do want to take just a moment to look at what's been going on in the South up to this point. Between 1775 and 1778. So when the war first broke out in Virginia, Lord Dunmore, who was the royal governor of Virginia, tried to prevent a Patriot insurrection in late 1775, moving stores of gunpowder from the Patriots. And in November and December of 1775, these Virginia Patriot forces went to battle with Dunmore's loyalist men, eventually defeating them on New Year's Day, 1776, driving them out of Norfolk, Virginia. And yes, that's how you pronounce it.
Norfolk.
Slick. Yeah, sure. Don't tell people from Norfolk that. And then Dunmore was forced to leave Virginia and cede control of the local government to the Patriots. He never returned again. This is actually a story. There's a lot more to Lord Dunmore's war. One thing that we really didn't cover on this podcast, that certainly if you want to learn more about it, you can look it up. There's a lot to it. We could do an entire 1 hour episode just on Lord Dunmore's war. But for very specific reasons, about a few months ago, I chose not to. In Georgia, that same month, Georgia's royal governor, James Wright, was also removed from his position. In South Carolina, more of a formal engagement happened between the British forces and the colonial patriots, right? So when war broke out in 1775, South Carolina was pretty divided. The lowlands area and the area closer to the coast were dominated, which is dominated by Charlestown, present-day Charleston. This was pretty heavily patriot-held areas, while the backcountry were dominated by loyalist sympathizers. In 1775, both sides began to actively recruit militias from South Carolina to represent their respective fighting interests, but pretty quickly, the recruitment of patriot forces was able to outpace greatly those of the loyalists, and most were forced out of South Carolina, fled to either Florida or to Cherokee lands. In June of 1776, as we've mentioned a couple times on this podcast, Sir Henry Clinton, who we were introduced to in more detail as the new commander-in-chief in the colonies last episode, laid siege to Charleston in the Battle of Sullivan's Island, also sometimes referred to as the Battle of Fort Moultrie, in order to secure a port in the South for the British at the very beginning of the war. And as I'm sure you remember, because certainly you don't forget anything from this podcast, and if you don't remember, though, I am reminding you, the British were unable to defeat the colonists in Charleston. And what many people viewed at the time was a pretty unexplainable failure on the part of the British. And we went into detail about, the soft palmetto logs and the fact that there's a sandbar in Charleston that you can't really get ships through. And they learned their lesson. We'll talk more about that, how they changed their approach the second time down. Clinton was embarrassed, furious, decided to leave the South, head to New York, meet up with Howe, and fight in subsequent battles of New York, Long Island, White Plains.
Which Mr. Clinton succeeded brilliantly, leading the key flank through Jamaica Pass in the Battle of Long Island. So
yes, he did, right? And that was his idea, and it worked very, very well. And then he did it again at Germantown. The exact same thing to George Washington again. That's depressing. Now, as I've mentioned before, some historians contend, and fairly so, that the failure to take Charleston in 1776, when looking back on it, may have been the reason why the British were eventually not able to take and hold the South, while also at the same time allowing the Patriots to use the port of Charleston for the next 4 years. So it ended up being a huge blow, the fact that they weren't able to take it. Lastly, in Florida, there were some efforts in Florida from the British and the Loyalists. While the Loyalists were unable to take and hold Charleston, they did have control and possession of St. Augustine in East Florida. Throughout 1777 and 1778, there were a few thousand Patriot men who tried a couple times to take the garrison in St. Augustine to no avail, leaving East Florida in the hands of the British for the remainder of the conflict. And that sort of brings us up to speed with where we left off last episode with the French and the Spanish. Well, the Spanish haven't joined yet, but the French joining the war, with Howe being removed from command and the British deciding that they are going to change up strategy, and they decide that they're going to move south. And Zach, what are some of the reasons why the British felt like it would be a good idea to move to the south?
Well, you had mentioned this in the last episode with France and Spain joining the war. Basically, Henry Clinton, who took over for Howe, his army is depleted in size, as now imperial commitments require the British government to basically pull troops out of the American theater to move to either the Caribbean or Canada for offensive operations, St. Augustine to protect Florida, as you mentioned. So with that, they're running into a manpower issue. Clinton himself estimates that he needs about 30,000 men to hold New York as well.
Not getting that.
Yeah. To hold New York as well as to have offensive operations against the Patriots. Basically, by the early 1779, he only has 13,000, half of which are German mercenaries. Actually, in 17...
And then some others are loyalists from the colonies who are not close to as effective in fighting as the trained British army.
Yeah, his forces are also split. He has about 4,000 men in Newport, and there's a battle of basically Newport and Rhode Island where this was technically the first French involvement. The British got...
That didn't go well. Correct me if I'm wrong. D'Estaing and Sullivan, right?
Yes.
And D'Estaing was basically like, Sullivan, you suck. You have no idea what you're doing.
Well, the British
And
got
bailed on him, more
lucky
or less.
because there was a storm that basically they had a smaller fleet, and the storm broke up the French fleet, which basically allowed Clinton to relieve the garrison at Newport, and then basically the American combined French force had to withdraw in face of superior numbers. But the point is that the British are now basically under pressure, right? Where they have detachments in different places, their roads of communication and transportation are now under threat, whereas before they basically had complete freedom. So the war government needs to they want to continue to prosecute the war, yet they have a manpower issue. So where do they look? They look actually to loyalists. And this was a very interesting, you could call it quirk or blind spot in Lord Germain, who was the American secretary for the British war government. And he believed very strongly that there was a large population of loyalists. This was shared throughout the British government. And even in, I have a quote here. That as late as 1780 in the House of Commons, he said he was convinced that more than half the people in America were friends of this country, meaning England, and only the, quote, tyranny of the Congress prevented the loyalists from taking up arms. So basically, they have a manpower issue, and they're looking for loyalists. Now, Germain had a blind spot to people who would basically give him the information he wanted to hear. We would call that today confirmation bias. And his confirmation bias made him very susceptible to loyalists who were from the South, who were very close to their British friends and cousins in the Caribbean, being slaveholders and plantation folks, saying, oh no, if you just went to the South, the loyalists would arise and defend you and support your army and your grand endeavors. And in that, because of that, Lord Germain and the War Cabinet devises the Southern strategy, which is to focus offensive operations in the South, to rely under the theory that there's a large loyalist population there waiting to take up arms if we can only equip them. Now, given though that there's been a depletion of regular troops and they're getting ready to arm irregular troops, the war is getting ready to enter into a much more something that will be much more akin to a civil war, closer to fratricide and other very violent tick-for-tack killings that will occur. And we'll talk about those later. But that's the basic logic behind moving to the South.
That's great, and I appreciate that overview. And a couple other things to keep in mind is when the loyalists are telling Germain, oh, if you only move south, all of the loyalists will come save you. Number one, they're looking out for their own hide, right? They want to protect their land. They want to get in good favor with the government if their plan does work out.
Or they want their land back.
They want their land back. Yeah, very good, right? A lot of them are refugees. And this is one of the reasons why General Howe had no interest in continuing, because General Howe had heard this for the last 2 or 3 years, in Maryland, in Pennsylvania, in New York, in Delaware. Oh, well, if you just do this, the loyalists will come out. If you just do this, the loyalists will come out. And he was like, yeah, no, I'm not buying that anymore. Maybe there are more loyalists in the South, but I'm not going down there and beginning an entirely new campaign based off a promise that I've heard personally from people here in the colonies for years that has never come true. That's one of the reasons why Howe bailed.
Clinton, this loyalist question is pretty interesting because it comes back to this point of basically spreading the British forces. Because the British war government believed that if British troops just showed up, it would empower loyalists, it would, but only as long as the British troops remained. When the British troops would withdraw, then the loyalists were suddenly exposed and under threat of attack from patriots. So it taxed the British war effort every time they would essentially cut and run. This is a term that, for people who were around during the 2000s would be familiar with. That was said a lot. But basically that if the British troops left, then loyalist refugees would follow with them. They would need care, support, supply, putting extra strain on the war effort, requiring more money, more food, more ships, more wagons, more horses, bigger trains. So a lot of the British generals became very resentful of this idea, and Henry Clinton, and Lord Cornwallis both want to resign because they realize, hey, we're under stress. We don't have enough troops to do this. We don't want to be involved in this. Henry Clinton is obsessed with the perception that he's going to be the scapegoat for this thing going wrong. Lord Cornwallis wants nothing to do with it either. Yet both of these guys are going to be very instrumental to actually winning at first.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing that we find out is that because you need the soldiers to stay, this is not going to be a useful strategy in this war for independence. I mean, because as you know, and as we're coming to find out more and more, this was not a war of cities. It was a war of identity and a war of ideas, and it was much more nebulous and challenging to defeat. I also think that the British really underestimated how many people there were in the colonies who were impartial, or at least impartial enough not to choose a side. A lot of the assumptions from the gentry and from the cabinet was that if they're not fighting for the Patriots, then they're loyalists and they're just waiting for an opportunity to fight for us. But that really wasn't always the case. But nonetheless, the British were confident that this strategy could work, that with Cornwallis actually wrote to Clinton that, quote, our assurances of attachment from our poor distressed friends in North Carolina are as strong as ever. But one more thing, I think it's wise to look at the politics in Britain too, because the gentry in Parliament were fans of the taxes in the colonies. It lessened the tax burden on them. And if you remember, Lord North, when he was afraid that an alliance with France might be coming soon and wanted to figure out a way to lower tensions with the colonies in 1777, repealed the taxes in the colonies in 1778, early 78, and it once again put more pressure on the gentry to provide money for the war effort. They figured if they were able to support a plan in which the war moved to the South, then maybe the American Tories, the loyalists themselves, would provide the manpower, and the support for this war strategy was placing considerable pressure on them to support the suppression of the rebellion, which, as we will come to find out, was not a wise strategy. So not only did it rely on the Tory loyalists in the South, but they did it in order to gain political support for the war. Therefore, if more politicians tied themselves to this idea of Tory support, they wanted, like you mentioned earlier, Zach, this confirmation bias. They kept looking for the confirmation that this was a good idea and this was working and that there were enough Tories there. So as things began to unravel in the South and not go the way that they want, they really were sort of blind to the realities of the situation because they had tied their entire political maneuvering to this reality that really did not exist. So it really ends up being a pretty crappy situation for them. And as the campaign progresses, Cornwallis finds out sooner rather than later that they were mistaken, and this assumption of Tory support was not correct. So let's jump to December 29th, 1778, and talk about the British taking Savannah. They were able to take Savannah fairly easily. They had an expeditionary corps of about 3,500 men led by Colonel Archibald Campbell, and they sent him down to capture Savannah, Georgia, because the idea was that they were going to go really far south. They were going to go all the way south, and they were going to capture cities and slowly move further north, all the way up to Virginia eventually. And as they moved north, they were going to have loyalist support take over in these local governments and basically run the colonies in their absence under the protection of the crown. And after they took Savannah, December 29, 1778, they were joined by Brigadier General Augustine Prevost, who had marched up from St. Augustine, Florida. And yes, the names are just a coincidence. Soon after arriving, Prevost dispatched about 1,000 men to take Augusta, who were then able to take the city without much resistance. With the remnants of the colonial defenses retreating to Charleston. So the British have now taken Savannah and they've taken Augusta. The British were really able to grab a foothold in Georgia, and Loyalist support in the area was beginning to turn out in increasing numbers, and it looked like, at least for a brief moment, that this Southern strategy was going to work. And as we'll talk about in this episode, really nothing that happens in the rest of this episode makes them think otherwise. While the British decided it was likely best not to stay and hold Augusta, the ease with which they were able to take it showed just how vulnerable the South was. Meanwhile, General Benjamin Lincoln, the commander of the colonial forces in the South the American forces, he was in Charleston preparing for the defense of that city because he knew that the British were going to be coming after Charleston as one of the major port city in the South, and one that they had already tried to take 3 years earlier and failed. Being reinforced by large numbers of men throughout the area and also receiving additional military supplies from the Dutch, though, Clinton was feeling pretty good about his situation, and he said, you know what? April 1779, I'm going to go north toward Augusta to try to take that back. And yes, you heard me right. Going from Charleston, South Carolina to Augusta, Georgia is going north. Significantly north, actually. And Zach, I can see you trying to picture the map in your head now.
Yeah, I got yelled at by my girlfriend the other day because I screwed up something in geography. So I'm just like, wait a second. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, significantly north, right? The first time I read that, I was like, hold on a second. I'm like, wait, no, that is right. Yeah.
I'm just going to bring up Google Maps here real quick just to make sure.
So in April 1779, Clinton headed north to Augusta, try and take back the city, but then Prevost found out he was going to Augusta, and he headed to Charleston. Clinton doubled back, went back to Charleston, and was able to force Prevost to withdraw, so was able to hold him to Charleston at least for a little bit. They got into a rearguard action battle. Prevost was actually able to defeat Lincoln's advance in the rearguard action of the Battle of Stono Ferry. But eventually Prevost withdrew. And did you know, in this battle of Stono Ferry, Hugh Jackson, the older brother of Andrew Jackson, died in this battle? Do you know that fact?
I did not know that. That would have been a good, did you know?
Yeah, I probably should have included that.
I think that might have been a little bit better. Oh, well.
Yeah, well, whatever.
Edit it.
Yeah. No, we'll leave it.
Editor.
But although he wasn't able to take Augusta, Lincoln still felt pretty good about his situation. Along with support from the French Naval Squadron, he in October of 1779, he attempted to take back Savannah. That was a spectacular failure. The French fleet realized that the bombardment was doing little damage to the defense of Savannah. They decided to attack on land. They got totally destroyed. And the great Casimir Pulaski, the father of the American cavalry, died in that battle. And he was the guy that I'm pretty sure we talked about in the Who's Who of the American Revolution episode, because he was the man.
So just to pause you there real quick, this is an important setup for like how Yorktown could have gone bad. Like everybody kind of, assuming if you're listening to this podcast, you know something about history, so you know Yorktown's a big battle that's coming. But Savannah is the example of how like Yorktown could have gone really bad. So D'Estaing, the French admiral, basically flush off a victory in the Caribbean. He defeats a British fleet there at Grenada. He takes actually Grenada and another island. Hands the British their worst naval defeat since I think like 1690 or 1609. I can't remember what the exact dates. I think 1690. Yeah, but like a big defeat. Flush with victory, goes north to Savannah, meets up with a bigger Patriot army. They outnumber the British. They should totally win and capture another British army, and it just all goes wrong. There's problems with unity of command. There's problems with just basic strategy. D'Estaing will leave and go back to France after this, not necessarily in shame of defeat, but basically, a mixed success. He did well in the Caribbean. He failed at Newport. He failed at Savannah. But, maybe, this is this moment where it's like, are combined Franco-American operations really going to work? Can we really pull this off? Can we really beat the British? Or are we just going to kind of screw it up and get in our way and argue over stuff and not do a good job? So it's important to just point out this: Yorktown is where everything goes right. Savannah is where everything went wrong.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Zach, because up to this point, things were not going well. They had lost Savannah, they had lost Augusta. They tried to take back Augusta, then had to bail on that to come protect Charleston. They tried to take back Savannah, and that was, like I said, a spectacular disaster for the American and the French forces. And at this point, the British had secured Savannah once and for all. They had Augusta, and now it was time to turn their attention to Charleston. And this is where Clinton is going to come down from New York, because for the calendar year of 1779, while all of this was going back and forth with Campbell and Prevost and and Lincoln, Sir Henry Clinton has been up in New York, not really doing much. But he decided to finally head south. In late December 1779, Clinton and his second in command, Lord Cornwallis, sailed from New York with 8,500 troops and 5,000 sailors. And this is something that Clinton did not look forward to, because by all accounts, he absolutely hated sailing. And I would imagine he really hated doing it during the dead of winter through heavy storms. One of his men in the voyage mentioned that each day was, quote, always the same weather: storm, rain, hail, snow, and the waves breaking over the cabin. And it talked about the mast being ripped down and the sails being ripped off. A couple of the ships actually sank. They were flipped over. So bad stuff. But he eventually does make it down in February 1780. He lands right outside Savannah, and the British then begin to methodically move north, closer and closer to Charleston. And they were outside of the city by about 30 miles by March of 1780. Now, Charleston at this time was a city of about 12,000 people, pretty eclectic population: English, black slaves, French Protestants, even some Spaniards and Germans. And for the most part, it was a city populated by the wealthy rice planters who wanted to avoid the unbearable heat further inland in South Carolina in the summer.
It's freaking hot.
Yeah, it is really hot.
Imagine
it
no
is really
AC.
hot. But Charleston's not as hot,
Yeah.
because it has two rivers. It's basically buttressed by two rivers. It's a peninsula right on the ocean, so it's a little bit cooler in Charleston. But yeah, it's really hot in South Carolina and Georgia in the summer. It is pretty unbearable. Charleston was also a city who, while it yes, did defend against a British attack in 1776, the defenses had more or less fallen into disrepair over the past 4 years. It was not ready for this type of invasion. Charleston was on a peninsula, like I mentioned. The southeastern tip of the peninsula is where the city of Charleston is. And the challenge was that Lincoln expected the British to attack from the east, on the water, just like they did in 1776, but Clinton had learned his lesson, and he landed men to the north and the west of the peninsula, planning on closing off escape routes one by one from the Americans, which they were able to eventually do. They were clearly going to lay siege for the city, and Lincoln had zero experience in defending a city from a siege, and neither did any of his men, so he was really out of his element. They began to lay the siege on April 1st of 1780, and the British systematically surrounded the city and wore down the defenses of Charleston. They built parallel trenches to the American trenches and methodically moved ever closer to these American trenches with hopes that the Americans would eventually surrender. Because Clinton didn't want to have to destroy the city in any way. He wanted to occupy the city. Therefore, he wished to keep it intact as much as possible. At the idea of laying fire to the city, Clinton remarked that it would be, quote, absurd, impolitic, and inhuman to burn a town that you mean to occupy. It was a very trying and difficult process of the British building these parallel trenches and moving them forward to the American trenches. Usually it was done in loose and wet sand, done at night with American men attacking each other, American and British men attacking each other randomly. And night attacks in war are the worst, because this is when your imaginations take over at night. That's why guys don't like to fight at night. It is extremely stressful and anxiety-provoking.
Yeah, the coordination becomes a nightmare. Friendly fire occurs. Night attacks are, in history, great examples of either risk takers and gamblers who wager it all with well-trained troops and they pull it off, or it just backfires spectacularly and everything becomes disorganized and just nightmarish and you lose it all.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in the Battle of Camden too, because that could have happened in Camden and they all chose not to for those reasons. By the third week of April, 1780, the various escape routes out of Charleston had been cut off, and General Lincoln was realizing that he was in deep trouble. But the citizens of Charleston still did not want to give up yet. They were actually holding out hope that General George Washington would come south and save them, which did not happen, and he had zero plan of doing. If things began to look more desperate and hopeless for Lincoln by the end of April, he requested, and this is a bold request, that he and his men be able to surrender with honors of war, which basically means that they are allowed to march out of the city with all their weapons and just surrender the city, but not themselves. Unsurprisingly, Sir Henry Clinton refused this immediately and said, yeah, no way. A couple weeks later, when the armies were separated by only a few yards in these trenches, the British, still waiting for the Americans to surrender, they still wouldn't do it, reluctantly began to shell the city. And then the citizens of Charleston and the soldiers were ready to surrender. They were at the end of their rope. Eventually, on May 20th, Lincoln embarrassingly surrendered over 3,300 men to Cornwallis, and as word spread of this surrender, other Patriot troops in the backcountry areas of South Carolina also surrendered. Initially, the militia were paroled, the officers were allowed to keep their swords, until they began to shout, "Long live Congress," right, to the British soldiers who had just defeated them, and the British soldiers were like, okay, give me the sword. Yeah.
Well, I mean, just to point, I got some numbers here just to point out how this is a really big victory for the British. Just the scale of what
absolutely crushing defeat for the Americans.
All right, I want to get this up here. So I'm going to be Chris. Am I close enough to the mic for this?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Doing great, man.
So the British had captured 7 generals of the Continental Army, 3 battalions of artillery, 4 frigates, several armed boats, numerous other vessels, 400 pieces of ordnance, 5,000 stand of arms, a vast quantity of gunpowder and naval stores, 2,571 regular troops, and some 800 militia. It was the single largest loss sustained by the Continental Army during the entire Revolutionary War. I mean, this is like basically the British's version of Saratoga, right? This is just total disaster for the Continental forces.
And not many people died on either side. It was just a methodical siege that forced the Americans to totally give up. Lincoln was trapped, and he was never able to get himself out and really had no idea how to defend the city effectively. Now, not allowing the Americans these honors of war really came back to bite the British when they surrendered at Yorktown, which effectively ended the war because they asked George Washington for honors of war, and he told them, quote, "The same honors will be granted to the surrendering army that was granted to the garrison at Charleston." The craziest thing about this siege, though, is that there were more people killed by accident after the battle than during. Apparently, the British soldiers were taking captured muskets and tossing them into storage area that had a ton of gunpowder. And although they were warned by some of the colonial soldiers that some of these muskets were loaded and you shouldn't be tossing them around like this, especially with piles of gunpowder all over the place, they kept tossing until the entire thing exploded, killing 200 people. That's 40 more men killed in this explosion than killed during the entire month-long siege of Charleston on both sides. It set 6 houses on fire and eviscerated everything in its path, with a German officer writing that, quote, "A great many suffered powder burns and writhed on the ground like worms." He also mentioned that there were pieces of bodies scattered everywhere and that some were so, quote, "mutilated that one could not make out a human figure." What an awful way to end this experience for the Americans. As Zach mentioned, this was a huge blow to the American cause. there was, for all intents and purposes, no remaining Southern Army. That was the entire Southern Army. It is now gone. Poof, just like that. The colonies now laid wide open to the British, and they secured a foothold in the region with another victory at the Battle of Waxhaws 2 weeks later. And the Battle of Waxhaws and I'll just talk about it here for a moment, and it includes one of your favorite characters, Zach, Bannister Tarleton.
He's not a nice guy. I don't really like him. I just like that he got a hat named after him. But anyway,
that's true. That's true. And by all accounts, I know in the movie The Patriot, the bad guy in The Patriot is based after Bannister Tarleton, and by all accounts, he was really good at his job.
He was also apparently a pretty boy.
Yes, he was.
Very boyish, good looks.
I've seen paintings of him, and he is damn handsome. I can tell you that.
There's a reason why they named the hat after him. Apparently, people wanted to look good.
Mm-hmm. There you go. At the Battle of Waxhaws, a group of loyalists and British soldiers led by Mr. Tarleton,
called the British Legion, I believe.
Yes, the British Legion. Yeah. So he led infantry that basically they were cavalry, and they rode horses, but they would also dismount and fight on foot too.
So it'd be a mounted infantry is the term we would use, or yes. A quick infantry, light infantry, kind of a hodgepodge force for lightning raids and quick attacks.
Yes. And he was really good at commanding these men. At the Battle of Waxhaws, he's going to win another battle right after the Battle of Charleston, a much smaller battle, and the Patriots surrendered. And apparently during this battle, Tarleton had his horse shot, and it was killed, and it fell on his leg. At least this is the story. And his men were furious about the lack of professionalism on behalf of the Patriots, because apparently this happened while the Patriots were surrendering, so the British were backing off, and then Tarleton's horse was shot out from under him. And so then the British troops just sort of lost it, all discipline, and they refused to honor anyone's surrender and began to massacre the Patriot troops. And of the 400 or so that tried to surrender, it's reported that about over 100 were killed with sabers, 150 were crippled to the point where they could not move, and another 50 or so were taken prisoner. And this became a lightning rod for colonial propaganda, as I'm sure you can imagine, and it got the nickname Tarletons Quarter, which is the expression for refusing to take prisoners and murdering men when they were surrendering. An intense propaganda campaign ensued following this battle to bolster Patriot recruitment and incite resentment against the British. Now, all of this helped the British to secure South Carolina. Things were looking really good. But before Clinton left again for New York, he revoked the parole of the surrendered Patriots. Combining this with the already propagandized reports of the Battle of Waxhaws, and Patriot furor increased dramatically during this time, maybe even changing the direction of the war in the South, and I don't say that lightly. Many who may have stayed neutral began to volunteer for the Patriots, and this led directly to the creation of the militia forces that were inspired by war cries of Tarleton's Quarter and Remember Buford. Buford was the commander of the American forces at the Battle of Waxhaws. So Clinton sailed back to New York, like I mentioned, because he believed there needed to be a defense against a potential Franco-American attack there. He left command of the Southern Army to his second-in-command, Lord Cornwallis. And Lord Cornwallis soon realized that he inherited a far more difficult situation than he had assumed. Although his time in power sure did begin with a bang, the victory at the Battle of Camden, but it didn't last. But before we jump into the Battle of Camden, I do think it's worth taking a look at the affairs in the state of South Carolina real quickly here. As I mentioned, the Southern Army has basically ceased to exist following the defeat at Charleston, but not everything was going against the Americans. A French fleet had prevented the British from also invading North Carolina, so Cornwallis and his men were stuck in South Carolina for now. They were low on supplies, which kept them from traveling north even if they wanted to, and many Southern natives that the British thought would support them did not. On top of this, subduing South Carolina was much easier said than done. The British decided they would pardon all those who gave an oath of allegiance, but that just pissed people off even more. Why do I need to give you an oath of allegiance if I haven't even shown outward hostility towards you? So now many of these civilians who were sort of neutral once again began to turn more towards the Patriots. And the hardest part about all of this, which we find out in warfare like this, that we're finding, the United States of America hasn't found out the last 10 or 15 years, is that the harder one pushes to suppress the rebellion, the more you just feed into the source of the rebellion itself. Nothing played a larger role in the war in the South, like during this time, more than partisans, like Francis Marion, Andrew Pickens, Thomas Sumter, and others. And Francis Marion is the man that the character, Mel Gibson's character in The Patriots, based off
The
of.
Swamp Fox.
The Swamp Fox. Yeah, there it is. Jinx, right?
Yeah.
Good. The Swamp Fox.
Great nickname.
Yes.
Great nickname.
It really is.
Top 10 nickname.
And what was happening is various British detachments were being destroyed by these partisan bands. Basically, these backcountry South Carolinians were gathering their own local militias and then just going out and harassing these British forces, and it was like, hit and run. They'd attack them, then they'd run away. They'd hide behind stuff. It was all guerrilla warfare, and it was extremely effective. And Francis Marion, Bannister Tarleton, the Swamp Fox, all of this stuff. This is some of the stuff we'll be covering more in the Patreon episode when we're examining the movie The Patriot. So we'll dive a lot deeper into this stuff in that episode. But just know that was going on. And throughout the rest of the fighting for really the next year and a half, these militia forces will continue to disrupt supply lines, attack British regiments when they're not expecting it, and just make things really miserable for the British in the South. But like I said, the Continental Army more or less ceased to exist at this time, at least in the South. So they needed to send someone south to reform it. And that would be Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga. But before we dive into that, let's not pretend like this Continental Army that was sent down with Gates was anything to write home about. At this point in the war, the Continental Army was struggling for myriad reasons. Most men did not want to fight in the Continental Army. They'd much rather fight in the militia. I mean, why fight in the army? Why give up your freedom if you don't have to? In 1776, when the war began, there was a lot of excitement about fighting in the army, but the term of service was only 1 year. And so then Washington was having to start over every year, and he didn't want to have to do that. So in 1777, the Congress changed the terms of service to 3 years, and it became a lot less attractive. John Adams bemoaned how the Army could no longer recruit, quote, men who could get at home a better living, more comfortable lodgings, more than double the wages and safety, not exposed to the sickness of camp. Because of this, the Army pretty much had all the undesirables from the colonies. When it began to get really bad, they actually began to draft the militiamen into the Army for 3 years. People either had to serve, run away, or pay someone to fight in their stead. One American officer described his men as, quote, only food for worms, hungry, lean-faced villains. Oh, and did I mention that some criminals had their sentences commuted if they served in the Army for 3 years? Yeah, these are exactly the type of guys you want fighting for you. As the Army began to be filled up with more of the poor and undesirables, Congress became less and less interested in supplying the men. Caring for them and ensuring that they had the food, clothing, and shelter that they needed, wasn't politically prudent. Throughout the history of organized governments, the individual government officials don't usually tend to pay a lot of attention to the destitute, the poor, and the criminals in society.
This is going to be a very important component, Congress's inability to supply the Continental Army when we get to the Constitutional Convention. So this is some foreshadowing.
Yes, and that's actually, I think it is good for people to know just how bad of shape the Army was in at this time and know how difficult it was for Washington. But you hit the nail on the head, Zach. That's one of the exact reasons I wanted to bring this up. Because Washington, Hamilton, and the Federalists, the guys who experienced the incompetence of the Continental Congress day in and day out, after the war are going to say, hold on a second, we need a stronger executive, we need a stronger national government. We tried this whole disunited government once before. We lived through it in the war, and it was a disaster. We can't do this again. And so it really lays a lot of the groundwork for the beliefs that Washington and Hamilton will have following the war. In April 1779, George Washington complained that, quote, a wagon load of money would scarcely purchase a wagon load of provision because the continental dollars had been printed off and were becoming so invaluable. To pour salt in the soldiers' wounds, the officers seemed far too interested in their own glory, career, and reputation. Troops felt like they were betrayed and treated like garbage. Because of these conditions, about 20% of the men in the army deserted. Anne Glover, a widow of an executed soldier, protested to her state legislature by saying that, quote, what must the feeling of a man be who fought at Brandywine, Germantown, Stony Point, and did his duty and went on for another march for his country with poverty staring him full in the face, and he was denied his pay. While GW did begin to crack down on these men, and he did execute some, there's actually one story about he took a group of mutineers, made 12 of them the firing squad, and made them kill the other two in the group, which is just a brutal way to punish someone, making them kill their comrades. But to his credit, Washington recognized how rough things were. After the war, he wrote that, quote, the unparalleled perseverance of the soldiers through almost every possible suffering and discouragement for the span of 8 long years was little short of a standing miracle. And that brings us to the last thing we're going to talk about in this very long, extended episode, in which we're covering a lot. So if you're still with us, thanks for sticking with us. But that will be Horatio Gates' experience at the Battle of Camden. Arriving south of Greensboro, North Carolina, on July 25th, Gates ordered his newly constructed Southern Army to march south toward Camden, South Carolina, against the advice of his officers, including the Baron de Kalb, who had previously been sent south with 1,200 men, and he was a very well-respected Hessian soldier. A big guy, really great soldier. And it was interesting because when he was originally sent down, Washington pleaded to Congress to send Nathaniel Greene down with him to create the Southern Army. But they were, Gates was the bright, shiny object. On paper, he was the one with the better resume, so they sent Gates, the hero of Saratoga. So, against DeKalb's protest, and Otho Williams, who said that it was a really barren route to Camden, and it was through the swamps, and there were a bunch of loyalists, and it was a really bad idea, Gates did it anyway. And at first blush, you may say, well, Gates, that was really stupid, but he at least had a decent reason for it. He wanted to beat Cornwallis to Camden, hoping to be able to take the city before Cornwallis arrived. Although Gates was joined by thousands of men on his march south, garnering the nickname, a nickname he gave his own army, quote, the Grand Army, he initially did not plan on attacking the city, but instead wanted to draw the British out of it. But with food running low and his men beginning to starve, he thought twice about that. So, unbeknownst to Gates, Cornwallis arrived in Camden, reinforcing the British numbers to about 2,200 men. The Americans still outnumbered the British by almost 50%, but Gates had his Grand Army wasn't so grand. He had a ton of inexperienced soldiers, militiamen from Delaware, Maryland, North Carolina, and Virginia, and these are the guys that are going to really be embarrassed. So, Gates decided to order a night march beginning at 10 p.m. on August 15th with about 3,000 of his men, even though, like I said, many of them were militia from different colonies and had never deployed together before. In fact, like you mentioned earlier, night marches are pretty complicated. And when you're just some untrained militiamen, you're not going to be very efficient or effective at them.
Yeah, for the listeners, just imagine like if you've ever thrown a group party or a group event, with today's modern technology, cell phones and whatnot, just how hard it is to coordinate to get people moving in a direction. And then you put that across scale, and then you realize, hey, food, water, ammunition, and you're going to go fight somebody. It's like it can be very difficult to get people moving. There's a reason why there's a term in the military called "hurry up and wait," which is we gotta go, we gotta go, we gotta go. Wait.
Yeah.
Just don't move. We'll figure it out, and then you just end up sitting around not doing anything for a while. So
yeah, and so that was a huge issue. So that problem number one. Problem number two, they all had horrible diarrhea, and I mean bad, right? Otho Williams wrote that, quote, they dined on a hasty meal of quick baked bread and fresh beef with a dessert of molasses mixed with mush and dumplings, end quote. And apparently the meat was like raw and it wasn't really cooked. Williams then stated that this meal, quote, operated so cathartically as to disorder very many of the men who, quote, broke ranks, which means throughout the night, which means that they were leaving the march to go into the woods to take a crap. And that is not the best way to begin a major engagement with a powerful enemy. Third problem, it just so happened, and think about the irony of this. Cornwallis was doing the same thing, without all the diarrhea. He left at 10 p.m. too, and they were on the exact same road, except he didn't have men who were sick, and he didn't have inexperienced militia. He had Bannister Tarleton leading his men, and when the advanced scouts ran into each other, like we were talking about earlier, Zach, not wanting to fight at night, they decided, we don't want to fight at night, and they separated around 2 a.m., they separated from each other and decided to wait for sunlight. Horatio Gates, realizing that Cornwallis had more men than he thought he was going to, genuinely asked his officers what they were supposed to do next. I mean, I'm not kidding. He really had no idea what the hell he was supposed to do now. He had underestimated his men, marched them into enemy territory. Oh, did I mention he thought he had about 6,500 men before the march, and he was told he had about 3,000. And he was like, okay, whatever, I'll do it anyway. So he had underestimated his men, marched them into enemy territory, bunch of guys who were literally crapping their pants all night, and now he faced a much larger and more formidable force than he expected. One of his men, Edward Stevens, pointed out that they really had no choice but to fight. So, outnumbering the British by about 1,000 men, Gates decided to form up and prepare for battle. He set his men up in typical British formation with the left flank, center flank, and right flank. The challenge is that his weakest men were incredibly weak. I mean, these were like farmers and your normal civilians who signed up for a militia, and they were all on the left flank, and they were going up against Britain's best forces. And once the battle began, it became very clear and was an immediate disaster for the American forces. The Virginia and North Carolina militias on the left flank had never faced a bayonet charge before, and guess what? That's exactly what the British did right away. They were so unwilling to face this bayonet charge, they literally threw their weapons down and ran away. They ran away so quickly that the entire left flank was routed, and it's reported that only 3 men suffered a wound. That's how quick they ran away. It was also reported that the North Carolinians fled all the way back to Hillsborough, which was 180 miles away. Describing the British charge, one soldier stated that, quote, the impetuosity, that's the word, right, with which they advanced, firing and huzzaing, threw the whole body of militia into such a panic that they generally threw down their loaded arms and fled in the utmost consternation. The unworthy example of the Virginians was almost instantly followed by the North Carolinians. A member of the North Carolina militia, Garrett Watts, later confessed, quote, it was instantaneous. There was no effort to rally, no encouragement to fight. Officers and men joined in the flight. I threw away my gun and ran. As the left flank collapsed, the Americans could not mobilize quickly enough to do anything about it. And instead of chasing the cowardly Virginia and North Carolina militia, Tarleton and his men turned their attention to the right flank of the American lines, trapping them from behind while the rest of his men charged the back lines of the forces. Tarleton later exclaimed in that probably real evil, nasty tone of voice that that he had in the movie The Patriot, that, quote, rout and slaughter ensued in every quarter. DeKalb, the Baron DeKalb, was bayoneted 8 times and shot 3 times, dying of his wounds a couple days later, which always blows my mind how he lived even a couple days. The battle was over in an hour with over 2,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, and taken prisoner. According to Charles Stedman, one of Cornwallis's officers, quote, the road for some miles was strewn with the wounded and killed who had been overtaken by the Legion in their pursuit. The number of dead horses, broken wagons, and baggage scattered on the road formed the perfect scene of horror and confusion. Arms, knapsacks, and accoutrements were found innumerable. Such was the terror and the dismay of the Americans. And this whole time you may be wondering, but what about Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, the man sent south by Congress to save the American army? Zach, what was happening to Horatio Gates during this time?
Oh, I'm sure he was at the vanguard of his troops, waving his saber, rallying the men, being a responsible leader from the front.
Yeah, something like that.
Good judgment, sound decision-making,
Yeah.
Definitely perfectly in line to replace George Washington, right? That's what happened, right?
So if you're not picking up on the sarcasm that Zach is laying down, he definitely did not do that, because Gates, literally the general of the forces, ran away. During battle, he mounted a horse and ran 60 miles to Charlotte. He then continued to Hillsborough another 120 miles and reported the disaster to Congress, regretfully informing them that, quote, in deepest distress and anxiety of mind, I am obliged to acquaint your excellency with the total defeat of the troops under my command. A week and a half later, Gates still wasn't really taking total blame for it and wrote to Washington that, quote, but if being unfortunate is solely a reason sufficient for removing me from command, I shall most cheerfully submit to the orders of Congress and resign an office few generals would be anxious to possess. Well, ask and you shall receive, General Gates, because George Washington replaced Gates with his original preference, Nathaniel Greene, and likely because of his connection to those in Congress, Gates was able to avoid too much inquiry into his actions during this battle. And this also reminds me of the Battle of Saratoga, because one of the criticisms of Gates in that battle is that he stayed in his tent the whole time, and Arnold was really the one fighting in the field. So, not totally shocked by this. So we leave off with Nathaniel Greene being left in control of the army. He takes over responsibility of working with Daniel Morgan and others to try to totally turn the tide of the war in the South, a task that will be a lot easier said than done. This was a long marathon episode with a lot of stuff in it, and I thank you for listening. Zach, thank you for joining me. I'm excited for the War Turns South Part 2, or whatever the name, The War Moves South Part 2.
Yeah. We did forget to mention something though.
Okay, yeah, no, I always forget something.
Yeah, if people can rewind their brains to the beginning where we talked about the Haitians, so
yeah, like an hour ago.
Yeah. So when the French come to support the Americans in Savannah, D'Estaing is coming up from the Caribbean in the success of Grenada, and he basically raises about 500 black troops from Haiti. That are part of the siege of Savannah. And that's what we were referencing. We forgot to mention it when we were there, but those people will later go on to be main participants in the Haitian Revolution, which is the second revolution of democracy in North America.
Yes.
And the Caribbean.
That was a did you know at the beginning.
That was a did you know in the beginning. And we forgot to mention it, but it's at the end. So we brought it back, right? It's
there
full circle.
All right, we
full
brought
circle.
It back.
It's very thematic.
Yeah, and I should have included Hugh Jackson, which we've established.
We can swap it in and out, right?
Nah,
if you made it this far.
Brian, leave it all in. It is what it is.
Yeah, just leave it in.
We're not perfect. All right.
I can't wait for part 2, Chris.
Next week, the War Moves South Part 2. Hopefully, we won't forget to include stuff we intentionally mentioned at the beginning of the episode, and we can keep it under an hour and 8 minutes next time. But
there's
thanks
a lot.
For listening.
We're moving fast.
Yeah, it is a lot. We are moving fast. I like it. Thanks for listening. And hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.